Okay, starting off with a few more questions today. So we've done one type of 14-mark questions up till now, and all of those follow a very similar pattern. You'll be given with a reason in the question, and you'll be asked to agree or disagree with that specific reason, and then also write other reasons for your agreement, disagreement. This is one type of 14-mark level mark responses. And I've already explained how to attempt such questions. You start off with a simplistic statement. You write the first paragraph, or maybe first paragraphs explaining that reason written in the question, and you then switch on to the next level explaining the other 6 reasons, 7 reasons in total for a 14-mark question, and then you end up your question with an evaluation telling very clearly that which reason do you think was the most important one. Okay. The second type of 14-mark question is when you're asked about how successful a certain event was in history. So you got to write about successes and failures in such questions. For example, the question here in front of you is how successful were the British attempts at getting control over India? This is a 14-mark question, and they're asking how successful were the British in controlling India, in gaining control over India. So now in such a question, you still need to write 7 reasons, but those 7 reasons will be in a balanced ratio of successes and failures. You'll either write 3 successes or 4 failures, or 4 successes or 3 failures. This is one of the most ideal ratios that you can follow. You can also go with 2 successes or 5 failures, or 5 successes, 2 failures. But the ideal ratio for such questions is to go for 4 successes or failures and 3 successes or failures. Okay. So in such a question, how successful were the British attempts in gaining control of India? You need to mention, okay, first of all, we've seen multiple attempts by the British in gaining control of India. At times, they provoked leaders to war, they introduced different treaties, they bribed different leaders, and all of these tactics, right? So you need to write about successes, how many of those tactics were successful, and how many of those tactics failed at the same time. So let's read this question. The British were generally successful in expanding. So this question is writing about the successes first of all. The British were generally successful in expanding the control of the subcontinent. They had modern weapons and technology, and they were united. The leaders were skillful, which gave them superiority over Indians in the battles, due to which they kept on winning with decisive outcomes and eventually got control of different parts of India. So this was the first reason, that they were advanced in the weaponry and they were united. What happened because of that? If you read these bold lines here, these are the analysis, that the superiority led the British having an edge over the Indians. The battles, all the battles had very decisive outcomes, and the victories were clearly on the side of the British. Second reason, the British extended their control by using local influential leaders whose support for the British proved to be vitally important, such as capturing of Bengal became easier when Mir Jafar the army chief, helped them. So the reason over here is talking about how the British used to bribe the local army leaders. And the example, the development of that point is how Mir Jafar was bribed in Battle of Plassey. This is very important when you talk about the examples. Just always mention examples, because this is how you justify your points. This resulted in expansion with elimination of tough rivals for British. And now the third success is the doctrine of lapse was another successful strategy of taking Indian lands. It was introduced by Lord Dalhousie, which stated, now you can explain doctrine of lapse, and let's read the analysis. Due to this policy, areas such as Nagpur, Jhansi, Satara, Jaipur, Baghat came under British rule, which without force in their empire was further expanded. So guys, we've seen 3 successes up till now. 3 successes as to how the British were taking control of the lands of India. And okay, there's another point. There's another paragraph explaining the same point, doctrine of lapse. And it talks about the annexation of Sindh and Punjab. Under this policy, British annexed Sindh and later Punjab and WFA as well. Actually, British had an agreement with these territories, so violation could affect British interest in the region. This is why they made plans and provoked them. On responses, they annexed the lands on making these responses as plea. This policy enabled them to have control over Western India. So, okay, if you look at this this question up till now, there are a total of 4 paragraphs that are just explaining successes. And the last 2 paragraphs are actually explaining the same point, but with different examples and different reasons. This is allowed. This is what you can do. And this is the perfect way of writing this answer. So I hope you'll follow this model answer while writing this on your own, that you get to first write. I mean, you can start off with the successes. So imagine if you're writing 4 successes and 3 failures. The purpose of writing 4 successes is that you're indicating that you're more inclined towards the successes, right? You're clearly telling this to the examiner that you think that this particular question or this particular event was successful. So by writing 4 successes in this question, we're trying to convey to the examiner in the beginning that British were successful in gaining control of India. And this is exactly what the events were like, right? Then you're going to move on to the next part. This was level 3 up till now. Your level marking question is written in 4 levels: 1, 2, 3, and 4. Level 1 is just a simplistic statement. 2 is when you elaborate that statement. Level 3 is when you perfectly write the first part of the question. And then level 4 is the next part. If you see, there's this line that it basically is some sort of a transition here. Okay, however, the British got failures in some of their attempts too. Now you're transitioning from successes to the failures. We need to write about the failures as well. For example, and if you look at the paragraphs, there are a total of 3 paragraphs explaining 3 failures here. Nawab Sirajuddaula attacked EIC base in Calcutta, but British were not able to defend themselves and were defeated. Any of the attempts of the British to conquer more territory in India had failed, as some of the Indian rulers were still powerful and clever enough to stop them. Okay, yeah. So we're talking about how when the British, when Nawab Sirajuddaula attacked this EIC base in Calcutta, British couldn't defend that, and this was a failure. If, let's say, they would have been able to defend that attack, they might have retaliated, and in that response, they might have taken over more territories of India. This is how this loss of defense, in this case, is also accounted as one of the failures of British in expansion. Second reason over here is the British also failed in some battles they fought against Nawabs of Mysore, Hyder Ali, and Tipu Sultan. British suffered defeat from them in the series of Anglo-Mysore wars, and for some time, Indians were able to keep the expansion of British rule in India. Eventually, yes, in the Anglo-Mysore wars, British were successful. They killed Tipu Sultan as well, but initially they did face a quite strong, you could say, resistance from the Indian side, and that is a success. Sorry, a success for the Indians and failure for the British. The British also failed to capture Punjab while Ranjit Singh was alive. Ranjit Singh was the ruler of Punjab. While he was there, the British did not have the courage to declare the war against him. They accepted the authority of the Ranjit Singh in Punjab. There was no battle between British and Ranjit Singh, but his presence in Punjab was enough to stop British expansion. Yeah, remember when we were talking about how the British were trying to annex Punjab, and they weren't initially because of Ranjit Singh's power and influence in the region. After the death of Ranjit Singh, British saw it as an opportunity and they attacked. So, but this initial resistance or this initial hesitance of British towards this attack on Punjab because of Ranjit Singh proved to be a failure for them. And then, I mean, this model answer isn't writing about the evaluation here, but your answer has to include an evaluation, another extra paragraph at the end, where you'll tell whether you think the British were successful or they failed in expanding their control. But if you're writing 4 successes, your evaluation must have this agreement that British were successful. Ammad, are you clear?
Yes.
Okay. Please do ask questions if you feel like anything's not clear to you, if you're confused anywhere, because because moving ahead, we're gonna be going through a lot of questions, a lot of different model answers. It's very important to have a very clear understanding of each question at that specific time. So just do ask questions, okay? All right. Now there's another question. How successful was the Indian resistance to British attempts? Obviously, the Indians, they were resisting throughout this time when the British were expanding their control in India. We need to talk about how successful was that resistance. I mean, obviously, at times, the Indians, they couldn't resist these severe blows. For example, the Battle of Plassey, the annexation of Sindh, the annexation of Punjab. But some of the times, for example, the Afghan War, or you could say the initial resistance in Punjab, or yeah, uh, or this, yeah, the resistance shown by the armies of Tipu Sultan in the Anglo-Mysore Wars. Some of these events are accounted as successes in terms of the Indian resistance to British attacks. So yeah, Indians were mostly unsuccessful in stopping British expansion in India. So I don't think you should start your answer by writing the statement. This is a very extreme judgment that you're providing in the beginning. Evaluation is for this purpose. You start off your reason. You can a simplistic statement. You can simply write that Indians were somewhat successful in resisting to the British attempts, but they also failed quite a few times. So then you start off with writing all the failures or the successes. That's your choice. I think this question is, yeah, this question is writing 4 failures over here, and then a transition to the 3 successes. The purpose of writing 4 failures is that you're agreeing to the side that the Indian attempts were, the Indian attempts failed, right? Nawab Siraj-ud-Daulah had captured some of the lands of British in India, but Robert Clive arrived with his forces to retrieve the lands. Robert Clive bribed Nawab's army chief. So this is the point that's explaining Battle of Plassey, that the Indian resistance failed in the Battle of Plassey. Mir Jafar was bribed. Their army generals weren't united. They weren't loyal to their armies. They used to get bribed easily by the British. I'm leaving this up to you to read all of these other points because we've studied everything. It's just that you need to fit all of this in the question right now. You talk about the 4 failures and then you move on to the 3 successes. I mean, just 2. Okay, yeah, there are total 3 successes. Okay. One of the success could be, yeah, this Nawab Siraj-ud-Daulah's attack on EIC base. The answer to this question is very similar to the first question's answer. You just have to change the analysis. In the history exam paper, you'll see a lot of questions with very similar wordings and very similar answers. The only distinction in these answers and your responses will be your evaluation, so your analysis, yeah, how you analyze a certain reason, because that is where you connect your reason to the question. And if the question is different, although they might look very similar, but if the question is a different question, your analysis will distinguish your responses. Moving on. Okay, now this is just general overview of the British rule. When the British had entered India, they had fully established themselves. What kind of changes they had made in the political structures and the reforms that they had introduced in the subcontinent. Number 1, remarriage to the widows. One of the positive aspects that were given by the British to Indians were the remarriage of widows, and this rule was brought by the British in the late 19th century. The Indian culture, it didn't allow the widows to remarry, but the British, they abolished this law and they introduced this another one, allowing or legalizing remarriage of widows. Abolishment of sati system in India. Sati system is another Indian practice. So what this practice used to be before the 1857 revolt, it was the system in which the girl used to die with her husband in case the husband dies, because before the girl. So the wife was to be buried alive with the husband. This was a very cruel practice in India at that time, and it was changed by the British. Girls' education. Before the British rule, the girls' education were not found out of home. There was a strict practice of keeping the girls at home. This was a proverb that there was a proverb that said men should rule the country and girls should rule the home. Before, and this has been changed only after the British rule British came to the rule. So yeah, this was another. I mean, this was the Indian culture before 1857, and this is how the British brought a change. They encouraged girls to get education by implementing their English education systems. So, I mean, this point also has a lot of criticism. People also used to criticize that British were trying to spread their education systems in India, which is, I think, a good thing. I mean, we can just see how collapsed the systems, subcontinent's education systems were at that time. Spread of Christianity. One more important thing that came with the British was the Christianity. Before the Englishmen arrived, there were only 2 religions that were found abandoned in India. One religion, Hindu, and the other was Hinduism and Islam. Once after the British came to India, one more religion named Christianity was developed. Taxation was high as ever before. Okay, so it's up to you to analyze these reasons as successes and failures. People might say that introduction of Christianity was a success. I mean, obviously, people another introduction of another faith brought a different style of lifestyle. People got to learn a lot of things from this culture. Intercultural growth was in rise, but at the same time, it could be termed as a failure as well. You can say as to how the British were attempting to eradicate the local cultures or to dominate their own, and they were trying to showcase dominance of their own religions over the subcontinent. That is exactly your call. Then, but some of the points there exactly, for example, this girls' education, abolishment of sati system, remarriage to widows. These points, they I don't think certain reasons they have any room for an a contradictory analysis. If you talk about this remarriage to widows or the abolishment of sati system, they're just I mean, these points are just the successes. Considering them as failures might be going against these. I mean, um, you cannot present a contradictory analysis for certain points. For example, taxation was high as before. Now this is a failure. You cannot term this as a success because the Indians, they felt threatened. Tax rate collected by the British Kingdom was much more than what was to be paid. The British raised the taxes rates and they sold most of their products in the Indian market. Tariff policy against Indian products in the markets. Yes, they imposed heavy taxation on these Indian products as well. Abolished the handicrafts. They didn't allow the sale and purchase of the locally produced goods in the cottage industries. Discrimination. British thought themselves superior than the Indians. Sorry, this word this is not British. It's Indians here, and treated them harshly as an inferior race. There were also fewer job opportunities for Indians and more for the British. The Indians thought they were being insulted and hatred grew in them against the British. This is how the British rule was like. Education in schools, replacement of Persian and Sanskrit with English as official language, reopening of English schools. So yeah, British, I mean, now this point you can write it as a success or a failure, that's your call. If you write it as a success, you must write about how the British were trying to you could say rebuild the Indian education system at that time. And as a failure, it was a threat to the local culture. The language was replaced. The education system was completely new for the Indians. They had to learn English to study, to get jobs. The civil service examinations were in English, which was difficult for the Indians at that time. We're done with this topic, the East India Company, the entrance of British. Ahmed, is there any question?
No, it's fine, sir.
Okay, all right. All right, so we are moving on to the next topic now, that is the War of Independence of 1857. So we're going to study this topic through these questions now, because we're going to cover everything once you go through these questions. War of Independence was a revolt of the Indians against the British. We've seen the British rule, we've seen how the Indians felt threatened. They uprose against them. In different parts of the India, there were different uprisings against the British rule for different reasons. So we'll see, first of all, why did the War of Independence take place? There were some immediate causes and there were some long-term causes as well. So you can group all of these reasons together in form of a question that was the War of Independence caused by the greased cartridges issue? Give reasons. So this greased cartridge issue was one of the reasons, one of the immediate causes for the war. I'm going to explain what it exactly was, and this question will explain further reasons to you. So let's look at the first reason. The most important reason for the War of Independence was the greased cartridge incident. The British had introduced new Lee Enfield rifle. Its cartridges were covered with cow and pig fat to keep it dry, and it had to be torn by mouth. Cow was sacred for Hindus, and pig was forbidden in Islam. The Indians got offended and refused to touch the cartridges. British imprisoned some of the Indian sepoys, which further angered the Indians. They broke the prison and released their fellows, killed the British officers, and war broke out immediately. So now the cartridges, they had this layer of pig and cow fat. Cow is a sacred animal for Hindus. Pig is forbidden in Islam. So this is why the Hindus and the Muslims, they felt threatened, and they refused to use those cartridges. The British, they imprisoned those soldiers, and the soldiers, they broke out of the prison. There was a chaos. They broke free their fellows from the prisons, and they killed the British officers as well. And the British even started assassinations in return. So this became a cause for the War of Independence. Just a second. Doctrine of lapse was another cause of War of Independence. It was a long-term cause of the war. This policy was introduced by Lord Dalhousie. See, now the second reason is the long-term cause, the doctrine of lapse. According to it, if any ruler of a land died without a natural heir, his lands would be annexed by the British. This policy was misused in areas such as Jhansi, Nagpur, Satara. Due to this, Indians saw British as greedy land grabbers and opposed the British. So because of this policy, the Indians thought the British were just misusing these policies to enact more lands, and which is why they started uprising against them. Similarly, another reason was this interference in the religion. British had banned Parda, Sati. Parda is it's a Muslim practice, and the Muslims were threatened. Sati is a Hindu practice. They felt threatened after. I mean, they felt that the British were interfering in their religion. So when British put a ban on these practices, Indians thought the British were interfering, and they started hating the British. This is why they uprose against them. This was another reason. While you're making notes for this topic, Ahmed, I'd suggest everyone who watches this video as a recorded lecture, you can make notes by just writing the main reasons. You can avoid the details. For example, if you're writing this reason, doctrine of lapse, just write that. Then write the grease cartridges issue. So you just have a list of the reason, and you can watch this lecture anytime to get to know the explanations. You can also have these notes, so you can know how to elaborate on these reasons. But for making notes in the lecture, please just keep writing these important points side by side, okay? Because you should know the pattern of the question. The discriminative behavior with Indians was another long-term cause of the War of the Independence. The British thought themselves superior than the Indians and treated them harshly as an inferior race. There were also fewer job opportunities for Indians and more for British. The Indians thought they were being insulted. Hatred grew in them against the British. Okay, and this was another reason. British also disgraced the royal family, which also greatly infuriated the Indians. The emperor with his family was moved from Red Fort to Qutub Sahib Shrine. So the last emperor of the Mughal emperor was Bahadur Shah Zafar. Bahadur Shah Zafar's family was moved from Red Fort to Qutub Sahib, and the Indians, they thought that the British were disgracing the royal family of India at that time. And I mean, they had no right to move their residence. The British did this to show their superiority over Indians, and this created resentment among them. And the Indians uprose again because of this. Foreign battles. British had to go on foreign campaigns out of India, needed army to fight battles. Hindus were not willing to go out of India as they considered it holy motherland. The British forced them, which created hatred in Hindus against British. It was a long-term cause of war. Then replacement of Persian with English. You know how to explain this further. So these were all the reasons for the War of Independence. The Greece Cartridge issue, the banning of Indian practices, the interference in the religions, the movement of this royal family, the discriminative behavior, the replacement of the language. All right. So you need to know any 7 reasons for a 14-mark question. Again, let's look at the question again. This question was the Greece cartridges the most important issue for the War of Independence? You write about this Greece cartridge issue on level 3 first of all, and then you transition to other reasons. Write 6 more reasons for the War of Independence. I think let's just keep it till here. We're going to continue with War of Independence in the lecture tomorrow.